I think everybody kind of has this, when we talk about farmers or growers, one guy on a tractor, out there getting it done. And it's actually a ton of labor that goes into farming, and I think that's something that people don't, and the logistics, of farming. So you're not just growing stuff. Of course, you got to look at the market and, hiring crews to come in and harvest, or, there's just a lot of moving parts that I think people don't often realize, that go into farming. And then that's just, kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole lot more. You have to consider the water, you have to consider the soil, there's just a ton. And then kind of the cost of operations too, like how much it actually costs to farm. You don't just plant, a nice orchard and it just runs itself and everything just, goes to market and this guy makes money. No, there's a ton that goes into it. And then, the care that goes into it. It's not so simple as, let's just go out and this is a big one, a hot topic, of course, the use of pesticides and chemical fertilizers. It would be easy just to go out and say, "Oh, yeah, these guys are just spray jockeys and covering the world in this stuff." And that's not the case at all. There's licensed professionals out there. It's their job to make sure that these things are used correctly and safely. You can see a lot of how misinformation kind of gets in, like, through various, outlets of what farmers actually do, and we're kinda hated by the public in a lot of ways, and it's not fair.
Welcome, everybody, back to the Barrels and Roots podcast. I'm your host, Sean Trace, and I have an awesome guest with me today. Would you like to tell people who you are and a little bit about what you do?
Sure. My name is Lindsay Luckett, so I'm the lead horticulturalist and agronomist for Sunridge Nurseries, which is the largest grapevine-producing nursery in North America. I basically run the agronomy horticulture program, so anything all, plant health related, that's all kind of my thing. And in addition to that, I'm also our agricultural PCA, which is a pest control advisor, and I'm also our drone pilot as well.
That's rad. That's a lot of cool stuff. You caught me off guard at the drone pilot part as well. Like that was like the icing on the cake right there, man. I didn't expect all
Yeah.
of that. That's
Yeah,
pretty
yeah, I
rad.
heard the other day that there's only the less than 10 women in California that are licensed and certified, in the same way that I am to do what I do, so it's actually kinda cool.
What do you do with drones? Because that wasn't in the stuff that I looked up on you. Can you talk to me about that?
So, there's a couple different things. Well, first of all, so I'm licensed by the FAA to fly, unmanned aerial, so drones basically, weighing up to 55 pounds, and then I have what's called an exemption that enables me to fly one that's over 55 pounds. And I'm certified through the California Department of Pesticide, regulation to use said very large drone for agricultural operations. So things like spraying, imaging, anything like that.
That's rad because like I when I was a kid, I used to live out in different regions that were more agricultural and would see the crop dusters come down and fly through the valleys. And I was like, well, I wonder, are they still doing it that way, or are we using
Oh,
drones
yeah.
for some things like that now too?
Yeah, no, 100%. They still do traditional aerial applications, and drones aren't going to replace that, anytime soon, at least. There's some stuff that drones just can't do. But for someone like us, it's very niche what we do. The drones are awesome. We can actually use them in small plots of land because you think about calling out like a airplane or helicopter to do like 5 acres. It's such a small, area. And also too, as far as that goes with trying to schedule something like that, like if you need to have a helicopter or airplane come out, um, can take time. And unfortunately, in agriculture, there's no such thing as like spare time. If there's a problem, you need to get to it right away. So having a drone, you can totally just like, you know, get out there and get it done quicker.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Well,
Yeah.
I am fascinated by that, but I wanted to ask you because this podcast is a lot about, I focus on, and I did shift a little bit things too, because I really, for my Barrels and Roots podcast is about wine and growing things. And like one of the things too is like, I think with food in general is people don't understand that it comes from a place. It is grown, you go to the supermarket and you see all this wonderful stuff year round. When I lived overseas, we didn't have some of the big supermarkets, so we had all these fresh markets, and so certain parts of the year, you couldn't get certain foods, and It's so interesting, and I love seasonal markets, I love farmers markets because you see that as well. This time of year, we're gonna be getting plums, and then plums are done for the year, you know? But you've spent years working directly with plants in the land. What's something that most people completely misunderstand about how things actually grow?
Um, I think probably the biggest thing is what actually goes into it. I think everybody kind of has this, when we talk about farmers or growers, one guy on a tractor, out there getting it done. And it's actually a ton of labor that goes into farming, And I think that's something that people don't, and the logistics, of farming. So you're not just growing stuff. Of course, you got to look at the market hiring crews to come in and harvest, or, there's just a lot of moving parts that I think people don't often realize um, that go into farming. And then that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole lot more. You have to consider the water, you have to consider the soil, there's just a ton. And then kind of the cost of operations too. Like how much it actually costs to farm. You don't just plant, a nice orchard and it just runs itself and everything just, goes to market and this guy makes money. No, there's a ton that goes into it. And then the care that goes into it. It's not so simple as, let's just go out and this is a big one, a hot topic, of course, the use of pesticides and chemical fertilizers. And it would be easy just to go out and say, oh, yeah, these guys are just spray jockeys and covering the world and this stuff. And that's not the case at all. There's licensed professionals out there. It's their job to make sure that these things are used correctly and safely. And so I think that's kinda you can see a lot of how misinformation kinda gets in, like, through various, outlets of what farmers actually do, and we're kinda hated by the public in a lot of ways, and it's not fair.
It's interesting that we've had such a push to you see it everywhere. Tell kids to go to college, tell people to do this, but reality is our whole world functions off of farmers, and it's like my great great grandma was a cattle farmer. And my mom would grow up on the cattle farm all the time. And she would tell me stories about working with the cattle and stuff that was just so cool.
Yeah.
And yet I was like, I grew up with my parents that were in academia, and so it was more removed than that, and yet, I loved it because my mom and my dad always would like, they would take us out. My dad would say, "We're gonna go." His friend had a peanut farm, and we went out and we worked the peanut farm. He's like, "It's time to harvest the peanuts." And I was blown away by how hard it is to harvest peanuts. Like, oh my goodness, it's really hard work digging these things up, but it was so rewarding at the same time too. But for someone who's never worked in agriculture, what does a normal day actually look like for you? And what would most, like, people be surprised by?
So, a normal day for me, and this is gonna be kind of a funky answer, there is no normal day for me. It's a normal day for me is an abnormal day, if that makes sense. So, I do wear a lot of hats, with the agronomy, the horticulture, the drone pilot, all of these things, and I never know what each day is gonna bring. I like to see myself, my role as being like a problem solver, right? And I'm just supporting all these people, that basically, I work with every day and so they'll, come running to my office and this problem is happening here or here. And then I just help them, the best that I can to solve these problems. And so yeah, sometimes I'm out in the field all day. I'll be out there scouting, which is, just being out in the field looking for problems, looking for insects that don't belong, harmful ones, and it's symptoms of plant diseases or, abiotic factors like maybe, a water deficit causing, water stress, things like that. So that's my favorite part of my job. I love being outside and I love just walking around the plants and just checking them out. And, it's peaceful for me, But and then in the nursery is a little bit different. So maybe should I explain a little bit about how the nursery
I'd
process
love to
works?
hear, yeah.
Sure. Okay, so as a grapevine nursery, we don't actually grow fruit. We actually grow the grapevines. We grow our own propagation materials out in the field. We've got about 950 acres. We harvest cuttings from those grapevines. So no fruit involved. We harvest cuttings. We bring those into the nursery where we graft them and then we plant them and grow them into, kind of like little saplings, if you will. And that's what people buy from us. And they take them out to their vineyards and plant them and grow them to produce the fruit. And so there's a lot of different moving parts, right? I'm working in the field trying to grow healthy, propagation material. And then in the nursery, trying to grow these little, I say these little plants, they're little, but there's, at capacity, we're like 20 million a year, growing these vines. So, um, it's kind of all over the place. I'm always on the move.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I wanted to ask this because that's
Yep.
super interesting, and, it's such a powerful part, but, like, of the whole process, but people don't know about it, They don't know about rootstock. They don't know about, like, how you graft, like, what is grafting? Like, you talk to people
Yeah.
who are not into plants, like, what is that? I remember I had a biology professor who explained grafting to us, and we lived in front of our house. We lived in a house that he had sold, and what he had done, he had a one apple tree that he had grafted 5 different types of apples onto. And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
and, like, when harvest time come around, he's like, "Well, you're gonna enjoy that tree." And I was like, "What are
Yeah.
you talking about?" And when the apples came out, it's just like, "Oh my goodness, I didn't know you could have 5 different types of apples on one tree," but there
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
and it was
Yeah. No,
amazing.
it's incredible. Yeah. So for us, the grafting process, of course, we've got the rootstock. So a grafted plant is like basically taking two different plants and splicing them together. And so in our case, we have what's called the rootstock, which is the lower part of the vine. This is what's going to have the roots. And then the top portion of the grafted vine is the scion, which is the variety of grape you're interested in growing. And there's a couple different reasons that this is even a thing, right? So the largest one is Vitis vinifera. That's almost every grape you've ever seen in your life is Vitis vinifera. It's just a lot of different varieties, and that's why you see so many different variations: wine grape, table grape, all the different flavors of wine, whatever. So, it can't grow here. That's actually from
Mhm.
the Caucasus Mountains, Vitis vinifera is, and there is a soil-borne insect that's everywhere in the United States. And so since these Vitis vinifera vines aren't from here, there's no natural resistance to this pest. So the minute you plant a Vitis vinifera directly in the soil, you're running the risk of this pest just wiping it out, right? So
Hmm.
all of the native species, native grape species in the United States already have this resistance because they've come up knowing this pathogen, this pest, And so that's why we graft them. That's the number one reason why we graft them is because it's a root, it bores into the roots. So it's a little bit of protection. So this now can't affect your Vitis vinifera scion because this rootstock's in between, right? And so the other thing is there's so many different rootstocks and there's all these different, advantages to planting these different rootstocks. Some are accustomed to sandy soils or salty soils or waterlogged soils. And so now you can say, here's where I want to grow these grapes. What rootstock would be best? And I want to grow this variety. So now you can kind of piece together the vine you want to match with the environment that you're growing it in.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And I had a basic understanding of rootstock, but that just made it way more cool because now I'm like, "Dude, that's wild."
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, it's awesome.
And you've studied biology and now apply it to the real world, but how different is what you learned in school versus what the land is actually teaching you and like other people showing you?
It's so funny. So I have a very interesting relationship with my education. I went to school and I was kind of a jack of all trades. I like to learn a little bit of everything. And I did the same in biology. Biology is a very vast field. There's a ton of different things you can study and specialize within biology. I was always pulled towards ecology, which is the study of
Mhm.
organisms and their environment. And I kind of thought I was going to, be a conservationist and, this is what I was going to do. And then I ended up in agriculture and I realized this is still ecology. It's just a manipulated environment. We're changing
Mhm.
the landscape basically. But at the end of the day, it's still the same thing. We're looking at our species of interest, which is in this case our grapevines, and then the different environments that we're putting them in. And so I feel like in a way my job justifies my education, because I get to use so much of my education as I go. Now, there are things when you start studying agriculture that so it's kind of like, how would I explain this? They make it look easy. On paper, it looks very easy to go out and grow things and handle problems and deal with, the issues that can pop up. And it is not that easy. There's like a lot more to it. And so I'd say that would probably be you know, the big difference there.
That's really interesting. Well, I wanna
Mhm.
ask you this one too, because in wine, a lot of people talk about terroir. I can never say that word, and I do a wine podcast. Location. How the land shapes the final product. I can speak fluent Vietnamese. I can pull off some basic Spanish, but my French sucks. And from your perspective, how real is the location? And like, what does it actually mean at a practical level of you working with like rootstock and trying to figure out where that plant's going to be growing?
Yeah. So that, I really don't have a lot to do with the end product, which would be the wine, of course. So I'm just trying to start healthy vines, to go out to the growers and then they plant them wherever. But I do understand the concept. I know what it is. And it makes a lot of sense. Like once you kind of think about it in a broader, maybe, anthropomorphize it even a little bit. So we're all a product of our environment, right?
Yeah.
And for plants, or fruit, I guess in this case, we're looking at the actual berries that you're going to use to make wine, soil, climate, and geography. All of those things play a role in how those nutrients, that are in the soil, they're being metabolized by the plant. They're being translocated within the plant to different areas. So all of those things can change the nutrient composition within, these berries that you're getting ready to harvest for your wine. And,
Mhm.
it's easy to think of in terms of, like, coffee as well. So coffee grown from different regions,
Mhm.
you can definitely taste the difference. And so back to, anthropomorphizing this, if you think about it, as humans, we're a product of what we take in as well. And you can, clearly see that when it comes to, things like cholesterol. You eat bad stuff, you're gonna
Right.
have cholesterol, you know what I mean? So it's a nice parallel, to look at it. And I tend to do this. I break things down like in a way I try to, in a way people can understand. It's like the coffee reference, a lot of people are coffee drinkers and they're totally going to get that, but then some people it's a little easier to understand if you, bring the human aspect into it as well. So as far as that goes, there are certain things that the climate can do that can change the flavor profile of any fruit, not just grapes. And think about Florida, having issues, with the freeze and what that did to the oranges, and so things that happen in the world can actually change the product at the end of the day.
I love that. That's really interesting. And, it's like to me, I love like when you talk about, making it in different terms because I see, people who grow up in different regions, and they just end up looking completely different because of the diet and the way they eat and how they live.
Mhm.
But
Exactly.
there's
Yeah.
so many other questions I have for you, but one of them is like, what are the biggest challenges growers are dealing with right now, whether it's climate, soil, health, water, or something people don't know about?
Okay, so all of those things that you mentioned, that's water's
All
a
of
huge
them.
one, of course. Yeah, all of them. Water's a big one. Of course, there's certain areas that don't have as much water to maybe, do grow in the way that they would want to, because each plant has its requirements, how much water it needs a year to grow and produce and, get the desired effect out of it, basically. So, with that being said, though, it's not all that bad. There's a lot of good technology out there, subsurface irrigation. That's instead of overhead sprinkling, micro drip. There's things we can do to conserve water, and there's things we can do to help the plants better use the water that they are given. So you're reducing, right? Climate is a hard one because it's anybody's ball game, you never know. So we are in March, obviously. Here it's already 94 degrees. This is uncharacteristic. We're usually, 70s, maybe low 80s here. All of a sudden this year it's just super hot and we could get up to, 115, is the highest. And then we
Wow.
have, weather systems that come through that'll, maybe it's happening on the coast, but it affects us here, happens to other people in other places as well. But, all of a sudden we'll get, unseasonal rain, which can wreak havoc or hail or anything like that. So climate's always something that you have to be, mindful of. And then soils, of course, you're always looking at your soil health. You want to you basically want to replenish what you're taking out, and you do that through compost, fertilizer, things like that. So soil health is always water, and soil health go hand in hand. So it's something you always want to look at. Um, some things that people might not think about. So cost of operations, that's huge.
Yeah.
And the cost of labor is insane, and in other countries they can afford to pay for hand labor, because it's, just different in other countries as far as that goes. Here we can't, it's very expensive. So if you hire 20, 30 people to come in and hand weed your, vineyard or orchard or field, that's a huge cost, and then there's also too just the price of products, always increasing. And I've got a ton of calls in the past week if I've noticed the cost of fertilizer going up. And of course, a lot of fertilizers are petroleum based, or got another conflict going on, and then of course there's always the logistics side of, nobody's getting through that straight anytime soon. So that's going to drive up the cost of products that growers use every day. So that's something that's commonly not thought about, I think.
It's so interesting because yeah,
Yeah.
you're right. Products not getting through is a major problem. But one of the things, yeah, we don't realize how many things. I think a lot of people don't realize how many things plants need. Like there's a lot of little things that are now that have always been super important. But now when we have this global supply chain, that stuff doesn't get moving. It's challenging.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things too is, like, there's a patience to working with plants that most modern lifestyles don't really allow that much. What has working in this field taught you about time, control, and letting things just happen at their own pace?
So patience is key when it comes to farming or growing even houseplants. Anytime you're dealing with plants, patience is definitely key, but you definitely want to have a plan. You want
Mhm.
to give plants the time to, well, me, anyways, personally, to do things naturally on their own time. You don't want to rush dormancy. You don't want to rush waking them up in the spring. You kind of want to let them do their own thing because everything is what it is because it's been successful, right? When we start talking about like
Mhm.
natural selection or, I can go down that rabbit hole, but I won't. Uh, Everything exists the way it does because it works. It worked for the parents of, this organism and it was successful, or that organism wouldn't exist, right? So when it comes to, plants, you got to kind of let them do their own thing, but be ready in case something goes wrong. So patience is huge for me. And this is how I live my life too, with this, kind of concept of living gently. Be gentle, with yourself, with everything around you, everyone around you. Don't be so disruptive, in your day to day life when it comes to, plants. Of course, that means not going in with harsh chemicals at the,
Mhm.
first, drop of the hat, or don't over fertilize the soil because you're trying to push them to grow farther and faster because ultimately that's not good for the longevity of a permanent crop. We've all of our propagation plants, the ones we harvest from, those are been around for 20 years in some cases. And so if I treat those like a racehorse every year, eventually they're going to shut down, right? I'm going to push them too far. And not to mention what pushing, these vines to grow so I could get all these cuttings. What would that do to the quality of those vines? There's a good chance that I could be doing something that's ultimately not going to produce a good vine for you to buy and plant in your vineyard.
I love that. What do you think is the most fun part of your job, and what is the most challenging part of your job?
Oh gosh. Okay. So I love all of my job. I love the problem solving. I'm a puzzle person. I love puzzles. I love true crime because I can crack the case. It's just the way my brain works. And I love that there are so many issues that happen every day that I get to jump in and help and be useful. But what really drew me to this job is probably the thing I love the most. And that's that, because I worked as a field scout for years when I was still in college, and then, I was out scouting fields. That's all I would do, though, is just look for these problems. I wouldn't really know anything about finding the solutions, but I would find the problems and report them back, and then I kinda got into it, and I remember thinking, "Wow, if there was only a way to get healthy plants from the start, because a healthier plant is more resistant, right, to any issues that come along." And so this is my chance to do that, and it's so fulfilling to me to be able to do that, really, quality plants coming, out of our nursery is very important to me. So I love every aspect of that, including doing new things, trying new things that people haven't done before. I love that. It's one of my favorite things. And also, I guess, hmm, yeah, I think the worst part of my job, I'll put it that way. So I write recommendations for pesticide uses. You have to be licensed in the state of California to do so. that's tough. I live in California. There's a lot of red tape, with certain products and use of certain products. So I love puzzles so much, though. I'm out here finding the problem, formulating a solution, and then from there, looking for that solution, how I can't use this product that I would like to use because you can't use it in California. So what else can I do? So that becomes a puzzle in itself. The solution itself becomes a puzzle.
That's really interesting.
Mm,
Well,
it
I
is.
wanna ask this one too because I'm so fascinated, like, when something goes wrong with some of the crop that you're working on, what does the process look like, and how much of a science versus instinct to fix it?
So it's a funny question. I almost wish people could be inside when something goes wrong so they can see what happens, be a fly on the wall. A lot
I
of
would love
times
it.
oh yeah, oh it's wild at first, and it is just as dramatic as, somebody running in yelling stop the presses, because it's oh my gosh, this is on fire, or, I need help with this. It's pretty wild and everybody kind of runs around for a minute and then, settles into okay, now let's find the solution. And so for me, when it comes to instinct and experience in farming are one and the same as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
You have this instinct because of all of the experience you have, all the things you've seen. And when you're out, for example, scouting a field, you see so many normal plants, right? Healthy normal plants that when you run into a problem, that it jumps out. You can really see it. And so it's kind of the same thing when you're out when there's a problem. I always feel like a detective. I start with this whole, okay, what are we looking at here? And you go down the list of different things that could be based on the symptoms or based on, what people are telling you. So for me, and then it all comes together with science, though, 'cause I am a scientist and I've always had a scientific mind. So my first thought is, okay, how do we fix this? And I start basically going back through all of my plant science classes, all of my, pathology classes or entomology classes. I start kind of wading through all of that to see initially, identify the problem. Because there's problems that look exactly the same. It is really funny sometimes because you'll get out there and you're like, wow, these leaves are yellow, it must be this, and it's actually something completely different. Like, magnesium deficiency is a big one in the springtime for table grape growers, and it looks very alarming because the plants, they just kinda look a little more yellow, not desperate dying yellow, but just kinda splotchy yellow, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And, it's easy to freak out, but then you step back and go, "Oh, but it's the whole field." The likelihood of it being something pathogen or pest related affecting the whole entire field is not so likely, and then based on experience, that, comes into play when it's like, "Oh, this happens every spring," it's the magnesium's tied up in the soil by the amount of calcium, from the gypsum we applied, in the fall after harvest. You kinda go through this process.
I would freak out. If a
Oh,
whole
yeah, me
field
too.
was yellow, I would lose my mind. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I do too. I do too, every time, even though I know what it is.
It was a story. I worked in Hollywood, before I got my start into, like, working on podcasts and stuff, and there was a story that came out about a Michael Bay movie that one of the people was working on it, and I heard it from people who were on that movie, but I don't know if it was urban legend or what, but the people I was talking to, I tended to believe, and they had said that there was this one kid that his job was to back up the film. At that time, everything was done on film, and rolls of film. And this kid backed things up incorrectly,
Mm.
and they lost, I think, a whole day of shooting.
Oh,
And
wow.
I was just like,
Mhm.
when you
Mhm.
have something that is such high stakes and, vineyards, vines, anything in the wine industry is not cheap. Like, it is not
Mhm.
cheap stuff, And
Yeah,
so again, a whole field with yellow leaves would make me just have a nervous breakdown. So,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
wild. But,
yeah.
one of the things too is like, of you get 2 sides. You get people who think farming is just like, "No, I don't like that," or the people that romanticize it, farming
Mhm,
and growing, but, don't see the hard parts. Like, what are the
mhm.
realities that people need to understand if they want to respect the work behind it?
So, we mentioned earlier, the lone guy on the tractor out there, just making it happen or walking around with his family in the orchards and there are all these blooms. So that's why people romanticize it, Field of Dreams, the movie Field of Dreams, they make it, you know. So the reality is it's not for the faint of heart. It is tough, because you've got so many things to contend with. We talked about earlier, soil, water, climate, politics. There's a ton going on all the time. And I think too, it's so funny. I know so many growers over the years that, they've got people that work for them, right? They've got a foreman, they've got all these people that, go out there and they basically run it for them. I've known so many that don't just sit back and kind of let that happen and wait to be reported to. They're out there actually themselves, and fixing sprinkler lines, because they're driving by their field. They don't stop and call someone and say, "Hey, somebody get out here fix." They get out and do it themselves. And it is a lot of work and it's very, very stressful too. And that's, I think, probably what people don't think about is it looks so nice on TV, right?
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
It does
Yeah.
look I think that you see yeah, the Field of Dreams, man, is a great example. Such a
Uh-huh.
good
Yeah.
example, it's like,
Yeah.
it looks so beautiful. If you build it, they will come, you know? But, it's
Yeah,
not
and they do
that
have their
easy.
stress in that movie too, right? Because 'Cause they're gonna lose their farm if this happens. So, I mean, it kinda dabbles in a little bit of the stress associated with growing, but,
Mhm.
it's a lot harder than people think.
I think so. That I mean,
Yeah.
anything that you really enjoy often is, but, for someone who wants to feel more connected to the land, even if they live in the city, what are some simple ways they can start building that relationship besides going out and hugging
Um,
trees? Which, hey,
yeah,
if that's your
I
thing,
I've
do it.
well, the world we live in, I'd say listen to podcasts, that have anything to do with, nature or farming or, whatever. There's a lot of good documentaries out there, but if you wanna be more hands-on, I think the simplest way to start is houseplants. I know it sounds
I love
silly,
it.
but, you can learn a lot from a houseplant. You have to pay attention to this plant. It's not as hard, as I'm gonna make it sound. You're not staring at it constantly, but you just kinda pay attention, as you go on throughout your day. You don't wanna overwater it, you don't wanna underwater it. I'll tell you a secret, I used to be terrible with houseplants, like, I would kill them, which is hilarious now because I'm, responsible for the health and maintenance of 20,000,000 vines a year, right? But, it's something I had to learn is to be patient, and wait and let things play out. So the other thing you can do, okay, you got your house plant. Anytime you're outside, just think about things that could be affecting a grower, like the weather. What's the weather doing? And there's this misconception that farmers always want rain. Oh, there's certain times of year we do not want rain. Almond growers do not want rain during bloom, because that brings us a set of issues, that knocks the blooms off before they're pollinated, which means less almonds, right? Or diseases. Yeah, yeah, there's a lot that people don't think about. But, so yeah, just, kinda getting outside and paying attention or, looking at the soil and it's no longer just dirt, because dirt is dirt. Soil you grow in, right? There is a difference between dirt and soil. So starting to kinda just, think along those lines, when it comes to the world around you, even if you're in the city, you have an opportunity to see soil, and the other thing too is just learning how plants work. It's incredible. It is, and to me, it's such a gift. Every day is a gift when I think about how I understand these things now, because you have this plant and it's removing nutrients from the soil along with the water that's powered by the sun. I mean, there's just such a cool concept to plants in general. And then you couple in now how we can kind of manipulate them in a sense by pumping them full of fertilizer, but don't do that. It's like, let it take its natural process and just be there to help it, you know?
I love it. I think that one of the best examples, for me is, like, raising a kid. Like, you don't
Don't.
want to over spoil them, you don't wanna do this too much, you don't wanna do that too much, you gotta just set the
Mhm.
path and then
Exactly. Yep.
have trust that you're doing it right and not messing it up entirely, you know? It
Exactly.
that's
Exactly.
not
Yep.
always easy,
Mm-mm. No, parenting is also not for the faint of heart.
right? If you were to zoom out beyond crops and plants, what has working so closely with the land taught you about life in general?
Mm. Let's see. I would have to say you definitely get back what you put in. You
Right.
take the time, you be considerate, of what you're working with, and it comes back to you. How that comes back to you, of course, is different depending on your role in agriculture or as a consumer. For me, what I get back is going out and seeing this lush growth every year, and I still get excited. I've been doing this for so long, but, there's still things that happen every single year. I know it's gonna happen, but when it happens, I'm just as excited, because it means I did something right somewhere, you know, back downstream, right? Or upstream, I guess, rather. And, let's see, so it pays to be patient for sure, that's something you can take into life every day. It does pay to be patient, right? But you also have to be willing to take risks, in life as in agriculture. And the other thing to that, though, is calculated risks. When it comes to making decisions, should I buy this car? Should I even something mundane? Should I go to lunch with this person? It's like you constantly have to like weigh these options and considerations. And that's huge in farming. It's all the same, and calculated risks everybody has a good product, right? That's gonna, like, be the silver bullet answer to your prayers, And it very well could be, although I don't believe in silver bullets, I think it's layers of protection and when it comes to growing plants, but, when it comes right down to it, you want to start small. If it's something you're unsure about, if it's gonna work, if it's something untested, you just don't go out and spray your whole vineyard. You don't know what's gonna happen, so you do a small trial, a few plants. Did it hurt the plant? No, let's expand the trial. So if you start thinking about that, when it comes to your life too, take the risks, but also, you know, take careful risks, calculated
Mhm.
risks. Um, Let me think. I think the other thing that I could think of is how you treat people. It's basically reflective, like we compared children to plants a minute ago. Comparing people to plants. Treat people well. Treat plants well. And you get what you're looking for at the end of the day. Most times, hopefully. But yeah, I think that's the biggest thing you can draw out of agriculture to compare to life and the
It's awesome.
process. That's the other thing. A lot of people in growing you were shooting for the end result, right? Your glass of wine, your table grapes, your raisins, that's the end result. So people say, oh, trust the process, and we say this about a lot of different things in our life, right? Trust the process. I feel
Yeah.
like that's very end focused. You're trying to get to the end. Trust the process and you'll get to the end. When it comes to farming and pretty well everywhere else in my life, I choose to say respect the journey. Because when you
Mm.
respect the journey, you have this profound connection, with all these parts that went in along the way, you know? And when you have that, you have this gratitude, right? For the whole entire thing, not just that glass of wine. Now you're talking about all the hands that touched these grapevines to get where you need to be. You're talking about college, you didn't just zoom through and graduate, now you have respect for everything you learned along the way, the people that were in your life, the professors, the other students, that you guys helped each other get through. So it's a really good parallel, I think.
I love that. If you were to do you enjoy wine every now and then?
You know, it's so funny, not really, because I know
No?
nothing about wine. I
Right.
grow the vines. Now, I will say this though. Every year I have a conference in Monterey, go to dinner with the same group of people every year. One guy is a wine connoisseur. And so he knows what he's doing when he picks wine, and he brings his own bottles from his own collection and he'll pay attention to what everybody orders and he'll recommend, and it's great, I love it, but I do not know how to pick wine, so I just leave that to the professionals.
What then let me ask you this, are there any varietals that you grow that are easier than others and others that are harder than others?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't really let's see, I think Pinot Gris can be tough, and when I say tough, it's not so much growing it in the field, it's that grafting process. And because also when you're grafting, you're looking at, different, like maybe the rootstock is more vigorous than the scion, the top part of the graft, and so you'll have an incompatibility issue, there's things like that. That's the toughest part or, certain things, there's one that shall remain nameless that we're dealing with right now. It's really hard after we graft them and plant them just to get them to break the buds and start growing. And you'll have roots, you'll have all these things going on, but for some reason there's just some hang up. So As in the field, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know about what the growers out in the field, face with growing these. I know some are more susceptible to disease or certain pests, like different varieties more, but for our little, like, corner of the world, that's the problem for us is just getting some of them to grow can be challenging.
That's so interesting. Do you have a social media presence that people can find out more about what you do or a website?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn, and that's, of course, Lindsay Luckett I'm at Sunridge Nurseries. You can find me. I do have an Instagram. I don't really use it for work. So you would probably just end up seeing a lot of pictures of my, dogs and kids and stuff. So